I'm sure you've been asked this question 100 times, and forgive me if so. Did any of the risk models you were working on in 2019 include the possibility of a global shutdown of the economy in a pandemic?
No.
How was the risk profession and heavy industry capital projects impacted?
I always joke about this with estimating or project controls. I call it the great disclaimer, which is this is your class 3 estimate as long as you don't change the scope. I have priced this based on known scope at the time, right? Any project controllers out there or estimators out there will be cheering me on as I say this, but it's like if you go and change the foundational conversation, the price changes, right?
Welcome to $1 Billion Projects, the only podcast sharing lessons from thought leaders who work in mining, oil and gas, and all other industrial verticals, where the projects have budgets in the millions and sometimes billions of dollars. I'm Wes Sessenwein, founder and CEO of PayShepherd, and I'll be your host as we explore insights and challenges from the projects that we consider to be the backbone of our economy. Now let's get started.
So my name is Dean King. I'm certified financial risk manager through GARP, but I've been working as a risk professional for the better part of over a decade, I would say, in the Alberta heavy industrial and engineering construction space.
You started talking about education, training, and I'm always super interested in what people chose to do for their undergrad or university in general, or like a trade school, whatever it might be. Like what did you study and why?
I studied business. I didn't know really what I wanted to do out of high school. A lot of friends are going into engineering. Most people in Alberta, I'll say, if you're going to university, seems like most people are going into engineering or we're going into engineering. I didn't really want to be an engineer. I don't know why. So I ended up taking a business degree at the University of Alberta. And I went to the U of A because they gave me a little bit more money in scholarships, which was nice. And then my first couple of years of business school, I was a little, not disheartened, but maybe just it wasn't what I thought it was going to be. And of course, going through my early 20s and probably healing some of my, I don't know, my whatever, what's the saying? If you're conservative when you're young, you have no heart. And if you're liberal when you're old, you have no brain. Probably heal it. Probably in that transition somewhere along the line.
Yeah.
So I wasn't enjoying my degree that much. And then I just sort of settled into the fact that it can be whatever I want it to be. So I ended up just taking all these classes with the professors I liked and the content I liked. And I ended up with a business degree with a major in a degree with a major in business law and a minor in management science and operations. And it really blended. At the time, I was just loving the legal aspect, understanding the frameworks and the contracts and the international aspect of it and the local aspect of it and the administrative and the environmental, like all of it. I just sort of went in as far as I could, especially with a couple of the professors on the law side. And then the management science and operations was of interest, and that it actually led me to the risk work because it was the statistics. It was the modeling, the mathematical modeling, the optimization problems, the different pieces of software to model processes and all that stuff. So I ended up coming up with that.
Right on. Okay, so that's the perfect transition to what is the risk profession in the context of like heavy industrial construction, for those that are not familiar with it?
So I would say there's different taxonomies in the risk space. They're all confusing because they're all communicated inconsistently and incorrectly. So I'm going to create one off the cuff here. But in my mind, I always divvied up the risk space sort of between two dominant streams. One is, and the one that I spent most of my time in, which was foundationally a forecasting space. The other is a risk management space. Um, the idea of the forecasting is that the risk process can be used as a way to identify, and they of course overlap, but the idea is like the risk management space that I was in from a forecasting perspective was really you go through the risk process of identification, mitigation, um, really deep diving, understanding what could happen on a project, especially in the heavy industrial space, and then creating a model that would quantify the potential outcomes. So we would use something called Monte Carlo simulation, and then we would come up foundationally with a range of outcomes, a statistical range of outcomes in dollars and time. And then we would use that to inform how much contingency a project should carry from both schedule and time. So anyone who's done a home renovation knows that it always costs more and it always takes longer. My job was to quantify that.
And so if you start at the end for me, what does that help the bit? Like what does that help inform for the business?
Sure. So especially on big projects, sometimes that contingency dollar value can be in the hundreds of millions of dollars per project.
How do you define big, Dean? Like what is big?
Sure. So mega project greater than $1 billion.
Got it. Cool.
Yeah. So especially on if you're talking SAGD or a central processing facility or gas plant or a refining facility, a chemical refinery, the contingency value, a lot of people will thumb it and say, okay, we should be somewhere between 8 and 12%. It's always dependent on how much engineering has been completed as a proxy to how well do you know what the heck you're doing. You know what I mean? Have you counted? And the foundational premise of that is if I had unlimited resources, there's no diminishing returns of people or things in one place. I would just go hire 1 million people and go count everything that needs to be counted and then have them price everything that needs to be priced. And I would know down to the penny exactly what, you know what I mean? Like in a perfect world, I'd know down to the penny what it would cost to build this thing. Of course, that's impossible. And of course, that's not feasible. And of course, when you're greater than $1 billion, there's all sorts of variability in the project life cycle that can be injected and sort of surprise you, even if it's internal processes. Like I can't tell you how many times I facilitated a risk session and you've got a group of people who all work for the same company for years and years and years and go, oh, well, I thought it worked like this. Well, no, it actually works like that. Oh, well, that screws up the, you know what I mean? And you do that conversation over and over and over again. So, so how that helps is it creates a budget. Now, on a big project that's worth billions of dollars, in theory, if you do it well, you should create a level of cost certainty for the successful implementation of that project. That is to say, put it in statistics parlance, like I at least have a 50% chance of spending $5 billion or less if I have a contingency budget of $500 million. Now, budgets are budgets. I can make a budget on the back of a napkin right now, but one day some business will approve, the funding of that project, and then that finance team will go and buy debt or receive cash and sell debt to fund that, to achieve that outcome. On a bigger company scale, depending on the size of the company, and you end up with a portfolio of projects oftentimes. So larger transportation companies, larger producer companies, you end up with portfolios, groupings of projects along the way that are trying to achieve a goal. And you can actually run this process on them, and you can treat each construction project like a little asset in a portfolio. On the right time scale, and when done correctly, you actually create a level of cost certainty for the portfolio of the project. Sort of like the way a portfolio manager does this for your stocks and bonds, your retirement account, you can do the same for your capital expenditures. And across about a year or two, you end up actually, depending on the maturity of the company and all the assets and everything, you actually get it to a point where you're creating cost certainty across time, which actually I thought was one of the most interesting characteristics that I discovered in the process.
Very interesting. So what comes to mind for me is it's probably not a given that you will be involved at the front end, calculating and helping the business inform an investment decision, but then see and be there to have intimate access to how everything unfolds, and see it cross the finish line, and then be able to go back and test the model and the assumptions that you made. How many times has that happened for you, and what does that feel like?
Oh gosh, yeah. I wish I had a count. I can't say thousands, but I can't use my fingers and toes to count how many times. And especially once I moved up into a management level, and then I was able to see the work, not necessarily have to complete the work, but then see the work that my team was completing in that space, and then follow it. I was able to actually follow it more from the beginning and then more from the end at that level. Yeah, it's fantastic, and it also there's a risk of making an individual cynical. But it had the benefit of educating on the truth of how projects are executed, and when to let go, when to release the stress.
So cynical. Why cynical?
Cynical because sometimes it feels like as a group or as an individual, you're trying to highlight and solve and find a solution to the same problem over and over again. That can be the cynicism of it, especially in large organizations with mature project execution teams, I would say, or heavily proceduralized organizations. I don't know, maybe you've danced this dance before, but where you go from a large organization to a small organization. Just large organizations tend to have more processes, more procedures, and they oftentimes have to, because you've got so many people. You need to ensure that information gets from point A to point B in the correct way, and hence the process and the procedure to make sure that there's some extent of standardization. Oftentimes in large organizations, those processes and procedures can become cumbersome. What also becomes interesting is they become also the bedrock for your successes and failures along the way. So the cynical part was, it's like, wow, gosh, we're this big organization. We've done this before. We keep making the same error. Just like give it 2 more years. It's almost like a business cycle. Like, give it 2 more years and we're going to make this same mistake again. Give it 2 more years and we'll find the same solution again. And then give it 2 more years and we'll make the same mistake again. So you get into this, there's nothing new under the sun vibe, which can be, I don't know. You can let it make you cynical, or you can learn and accept it as, okay, well, what can be done?
Like the cycle of life.
Yeah. So, well, accept it. Don't fight so hard against it. Accept it for what it is and know how to move more gracefully with it, I would say.
How do project teams and contractors fit into that model at a high level? Like, how much of the model is dependent on the people?
I think anyone who's been part of a great big execution team like that, all the processes, all the procedures, all the automation in the world is still clicked by a person and accepted by a person, and hopefully read by someone somewhere along the way. Back to the sort of streams question, from the forecasting perspective, it's really agnostic. That's actually sort of why I liked it in that sense. Like, it sort of didn't matter who was there, because you would just adjust the inputs of the model to create a forecast. So some contractors are safer than others. Some contractors are cheaper than others, but then you get more change later on. Some contractors were more expensive. So from the cost and schedule, you could really play with the understanding and the experience of the group who understood the contractor. Of course, from a risk management perspective, the focus, especially in Canada, is around health, safety, the environment. The contractors, the folks in the field doing that work are everything. They are the ones that you need to defend the most systematically. So with your safety processes, your safety requirements, the environmental, and then of course the surrounding stakeholders, especially in the oil and gas industry. So in a sense, the people who are out in the field in the world doing the work, creating the asset, operating the asset are the most important. And so one could say from the management versus the forecasting, the focus, the lens shifts.
So I'm curious if you think about the variables that are inputs into the process, like in broad terms, like what are 2 or 3 examples of the big buckets that that are off the shelf that are always considered, and then equally as you get into the minutia, what's an example of just something that someone would say, wow, you've considered that? I can't believe that.
Back to the idea that there's nothing new under the sun. There's a different taxonomy depending on the type, from a forecast perspective, and actually even from the risk management perspective. You can create a taxonomy. When you sit down and think about it for a couple days, you start to realize that actually we end up taking the same types of risks over and over. So at the beginning of any heavy industrial mega project, even like really any, I mean, that's the funny thing, even down to the smallest meter station or well pad, or like it's all the same. So you start in the beginning with an idea, and then you start a regulatory process, right? Like it's almost always the first step is you figure out if you can get it permitted. You start that effort, almost right in step with the economics. So you have a business case that comes through. We think, you think you might have an asset or an opportunity that can generate income. So then the first thing you look at is the regulatory process, the permits, what permits are required, delays, the process, what's required to get into it, which leads to the next step, so you can divvy it up on regulatory, community, stakeholder relations, environment. I used to split a little bit because there's environmental permitting, and then you're out there in the world, you have environmental risks that you can create. They're different. Engineering. So then, of course, the permitting and the engineering team needs to start to work in step, and they need to start to align. So engineering starts like trying to design and think about this asset, but of course they have to give certain information back to the permitting team so that you're communicating with your regulator correctly. Then you take a look. So as engineering progresses, then you start to understand, oh gosh, I thought I needed 5 cooling bays. I need 15 to achieve this outcome for the commercial team. Okay, well, and then actually commercial has put some other requirements in there. They changed the deal a little bit. So now we got to add a compressor station, or we have to add a whole fracking train or an ammonia train or whatever. So then engineering starts to digest all this and starts to input back to permitting, and then they start to input out to supply chain. So supply chain starts to go and figure out who can, and I say all this because we start to this is how we assess risk, is as you move through the block flow diagram of a project at like a level 1 perspective, we go and we look. So now we're in supply chain risk. So early on, different risks exist, like contractor availability, material availability. And then as that matures, you get down to the conversation like, oh crap, that valve is late from Italy. Do we have to pay $100,000 to fly it? Like what are we, down to, okay, we hired this contractor. They're cheap, but the history of change orders is high. So we need to like add a little extra funds there because we're going to manage it like crazy, but we need to know that we've got some backing there. So that's supply chain. And then you work your way down into We always say materials and services. So we talk about the different risks with contractors or the different risks with suppliers. And then we jump into construction. So the actual execution of the construction. And that's to your question about the minutia, that's actually where it can really get the most interesting, because despite, a risk of HDD failing is sort of a typical. If you have an HDD, you have the risk, you take it.
What's an HDD?
Sorry, horizontal directional drill.
Got it. Yeah.
So, but maybe you need to switch to a directional pipe install, DPI, or maybe, God forbid, you have to switch to a microtunnel. And that just changes the profile of everything. And so, very, very, when we're really into it, we're really into like, is this going to be late? Is that piece going to be late? Is that landowner going to sign the deal? Is that, and it's not to name people out, but it's to be specific on the key inflection points, especially on really, really big projects. What you end up discovering is when using the project controls tools like critical path method, scheduling, combined with cost implications and the risk aspect, you can get very, very, very in the minutia because you find nodes that are just absolutely critical. Like, spend $10 million to ensure this crossing is complete this year. If you do, you will save $100 million of work next year. And if you don't, it will cost you all that next year. Like, you can do some really cool stuff with it.
What type of software is that? Like
my favorite for the cost stuff, there's a few different packages. We used to use an add-in called Palisade at Risk. And they have a whole industrial suite of modeling, statistical modeling pieces of software. You can go program your own Monte Carlo simulation in Python or whatever. But from the scheduling perspective, it's always the default is P6, Primavera P6, because that is just the industry standard. And then you can use, P6 has a risk software that receives their input, but we used to use one called Deltek Acumen. And I quite liked that software. It lacked a couple advanced features, but it made it, it gave you a lot of information that, it took some years to master. I'm not sure I ever really mastered it. I got good, but I don't know if I ever mastered it.
I'm sure you've been asked this question 100 times, and forgive me if so. Did any of the risk models you were working on in 2019 include the possibility of a global shutdown of the economy in a pandemic?
No.
And okay, how was the risk profession and heavy industry capital projects impacted?
I always joke about this with estimating or project controls. I call it the great disclaimer. Which is, this is your class 3 estimate as long as you don't change the scope, right? Like, I have priced, as an estimator, I have priced this based on known scope at the time, right? Like, so and any project controllers out there or estimators out there will be cheering me on as I say this, but it's like, if you go and change the foundational conversation, the price changes, right? So there's an extension of this in the risk space, especially when you calculate contingency, which is like, sure, we could add to the risk model that a meteor is going to strike and it's going to sever the pipeline, or it's going to take out half the crew, or you know what I mean? And you can carry funds for that. There's an economics question that has to foundationally be answered by the business and then by the project. The business always carries the risk, but there's a certain extent of like, so, okay, I've included this risk in my project budget. What's the probability of me really using funds allocated to pay for this risk, right? Like if I include $20 million to respond to my meteor risk, is that a good use of $20 million for the business? There's different ways you can delineate that, right? We used to call them project killers. Like, why carry contingency for an event that stops the project in its tracks and ends the project? It's sort of like a circular logic loop. Like why carry money for a risk that stops the project and returns all the money back to the corporation anyway? COVID was arguably one of those. The funny thing about modeling risk like that is you would say, okay, so let's say I had COVID on there in my risk model, and what was the probability of it occurring when I foresaw that this could happen? What's the probability? Like when we got locked down for 6 weeks, I was like, no way. 2 years later, like then you would have said that the probability of actually using this money was very, very, very low. And even today, I think now you would say that the probability of using money to respond to that is very, very low.
That'd be
So
my next question. So yeah.
yeah, so the idea that the good and the bad of this type of work is that there's it's always tempered with like a certain boundary of reasonableness, and so the practical version of this is for practical budgeting, for practical management of a mega project and sums like that, and the practical sort of reasonable use of gathering this capital and executing with it, we tend to exclude those great, great big ones because they're so improbable of occurring. But then, of course, if they occur, they're massive. So we talk about them, we identify them. Probably some project manager or director has nightmares about them and how they're going to deal with it. But we tend to, in a way, use the broader business, especially in big companies. You tend to use the broader, bigger business as your stopgap for those types of risks. We say like those will be borne by the corporation because probably you'd have to go back to the board of directors to fund the response to that type of risk, which happened.
Can you think of another COVID-like experience that's happened in your career, one of that magnitude, or is that the one?
I started my career in Calgary in June of 2008. Bear Stearns started the beginnings of the global financial crisis in September of that year. And I watched almost, I don't mean to be hyperbolic, but like almost the end of capitalism start to unfold in my first year of work. So that was big because I don't think I totally, even now, I think I'm really just grasping the interconnectedness of our world and that system and how it works, how it connects for good or for bad, how it connects everyone around the world and the impacts of that. And that was housing, right? Like the toxicity there was housing. And I ended up watching an entire engineering team, 300 or 400 people get demobilized in 2 days.
Really?
2 days. Project gets put on hold. Commodity prices are all over the map. Funding dries up. Like liquidity is drying up. People are getting called on their debt. Like, and I don't mean people. I mean people, but I mean companies are getting called on massive amounts of debt. Like no one's working. So I lumped that in there with the COVID one because really there was a high amount of uncertainty that was generated by that for a couple of years, I would say.
Interesting. Like in now to pull on that string a little bit further, I'd love to know. So that's when you started your career. Like, what was what were the milestones in your career? What was your journey that led you today, and some of the like impressive projects that have shaped how you're thinking about the risk profession?
Sure. Yeah. So I started as an estimator at SNC Lavalin in 2008. I got to work with some fantastic folks in that field. Like, really, I got to work with a couple, definitely a couple gentlemen who'd been in the industry and estimating and heavy industry, tremendously smart. Like, and worldwide, they'd worked worldwide, all of them. and I was sort of the new, fresh out of university, starry-eyed, whatever. Got to be polished, I would say, by them. It was hard. It was a lot of hard work.
You talk to them today?
Yeah, a couple. Yeah, very, very, a little more infrequent probably than I should, but yeah, a couple. So I got to work on some fantastic projects, um, like great big central processing facilities in northern Alberta, uh, front end engineering, and some like proposal type estimating work for a massive development in the Orinoco Belt in Venezuela. I actually don't really know where that ended up, but that was actually proposals for BP before their Deepwater Horizon event, for Gazprom before, obviously, pre-Ukraine invasion. Then I got to work at AMEC. Um, got to work on a great big gas plant for Saudi Aramco. Got to work on, and I'm not in country, right? Like it's the front end engineering, pricing, estimating type work. Got to do, and I got to run risk on all these projects. I got from the engineering side. Um, yeah, and then I think it was around the times of actually the floods in Calgary. I took some time off, and then I got into risk at TC Energy. And TC Energy was more dedicated. It was they had like our risk department, so I got to go dedicate my time and my space to risk. Whereas before it was like I was I was like an estimator. I'd have a couple accounts that I was responsible for estimating, and then one of my accounts was the contingency account. So then I would run the risk process from our perspective. I can't take full credit. Like I wasn't holding full sessions. I was more model building, doing basic interviews, understanding, receiving inputs. And then it wasn't until TC Energy where I was like standing up, facilitating multi-day sessions, doing the model work, doing the analysis, doing the iteration, presenting to various levels of management after that. That's sort of where that came into fruition. And then at TC Energy, I got to work on some great big ones like the Keystone, not Keystone Excel, though I did get to make contact with that project a couple times throughout my career, but I got to work on Coastal GasLink here and there. I got to work on the Keystone suite of projects, the remaining pieces of Keystone Excel that were completed. Got to work on power plants and proposals for compressed air gas storage projects, and gosh, what else? Looping projects, compressor stations, offshore projects, onshore projects. I'm trying to think of some other categories I could say, but that was sort of the best part. The best part of being in a larger, mature construction or project organization was that I was able to touch all sorts of different asset classes and geographies like Canada, US, Mexico. Um, and I've been able to get to know the regions and the people and the differences and some of that through this process. So that's been, I don't know, totally unique and irreplaceable.
What are some of the communication strategies when dealing with diverse teams of engineers, project managers, other SCM professionals? It sounds like there's a big facilitation element involved in the risk profession in your career. Like, what are some of the strategies you've seen work and the ways that you think about it?
I think my number one communication lesson was draw a conclusion. Oftentimes, especially in the technical space, whether it's financial or engineering or you get so many experts in a room, and it's sort of like sliding a piece of paper across and expecting. I always used to tell my risk analysts, like we would slide our risk results across and sit there expecting, whoa, right? Like, whoa. And no one has any idea what you just slid across the table to them. They have no idea what the curve means. They don't know. They don't care. And in fact, it's your job to care. And it's your job to express and then your awe or your concern or your interpretation. And then and actually, when you take that responsibility as a technical SME, you, what I found, not you, I found that it made me more responsible with perhaps some of my emotional reactions to my cynicism or my concern or my freak out of this is like, oh my God, look at this number. Everyone's going to lose. Like, no, no one's losing it. It's okay. Like, but let's talk about it. So with that maturity slowly developed, as that maturity slowly developed, I realized that you have to draw conclusions. You have to create an interpretation, and it has to be rational, has to be thought out. It has to be sensitive to the audience. And so that works at all times and in all ways. So how does it go? What's I think it was Aristotle or Socrates's, um, does it need to be said? Does it need to be said by me? Does it need to be said by me right now? Became guiding principles, and that works whether in a session facilitating and asking questions.
Can you apply that for me to like a real discussion or, what values? Just what would go through your head when you're thinking of it as a me now?
So like right now I've meandered through the guiding vision on how to communicate, right? And I haven't communicated to you. You still have questions. And so like even right now, what I'm trying to get at is there's a certain atomic level of information that needs to be received by people. And you can't assume that people know what the heck you're talking about. That's what I should have started off with. What I should have started off with is you have to say, it gets down to a level of, okay, you said this, right? I said all that. What does it mean? So what is the so what for me? Well, the so what is that I need to help you get to my conclusion so that you can question it and discover if it's right or wrong or otherwise from your perspective. So as a, for instance, my in providing results, my analysts, and I did this so many times, I'd slide it across and I'd be shocked at the results, and I'd get indifference or boredom on the other side of the table. And I'm like, you can't do that. You have to say, well, wow, this looks high relative to other projects. And by the way, the last time this number was presented to a senior VP, this happened to that project. And you know what I mean? Like you have to paint the story. We're all stories. This is all stories. And maybe your story's right, maybe it's wrong, maybe whatever, but you can't just say something and expect that everyone interprets it the same way. And so I would have engineers say, well, the stress of that is, if you do that, then you got to do this. If the HDD fails, well, then you have to do a microtunnel. Okay, so like, what do I care? Well, a microtunnel adds a year to your project and $30 million. And we don't know if we can get the machine. And I don't know if there's a contractor available. Oh, I didn't know that because I'm not an engineer and I have no idea. I didn't know the tunnel boring machine space at all.
And they didn't know the question to ask.
That's right. So, so bringing people to the interpretation and the conclusion, and then having a decent amount of humility that maybe you got it wrong, and maybe is probably the biggest thing I learned. So from a communication strategy perspective, I really started to break down my understanding of what I was providing to other people and what I was receiving. And then from a facilitation perspective, what the team is receiving. So did some engineer just drop a conversational bomb in the room and no one reacted? Well, probably I need to help them say, well, if this is true, then what from your perspective? And maybe, and like sometimes they think, oh my God, the world's ending. Nah, it's not. Actually, that risk has been handled by 2 other teams and they got your back and it's covered in the contract and it's all good. So sleep at night.
Have you taken any facilitation training? Like, or did that just naturally come over the course of your career?
No, I didn't, but I fell down a psychological rabbit hole for like 10 years, like learning about body mind psychotherapy and meditation, and really it's been a lifelong exploration on my side. And so actually I took tools from that space and started to apply it to my workspace. So that, I would argue, that made me more sensitive. So like I can tell in the room, you can tell in the room when everyone's bored or when the energy's low, or when something hits or lands with someone that it should land with. Like it made me more aware.
Any point of view on like upcoming trends in risk management and industrial construction? Is AI a part of that? How does that, in your view, impact the future of risk management, and how should people prep for it?
My cynicism is going to show.
Yeah,
Yeah.
fair. There's no model that can take what you've got between those ears, and right, that the OpenAI would not work for that.
Well, maybe it's more a generic criticism. I find the oil and gas industry, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think maybe this is also why Pay Shepherd has such a great opportunity in front of it, which is you sort of see how sometimes the old ways of doing things persist so intensely, and you guys came up with a great idea, and it makes it simpler and faster and easier and saves people money. I mean, and maybe it's not a no-brainer, but sometimes things like that, like it takes a while to really settle into an industry, and next thing you know, like your way will be the way, and it will be proceduralized, and it'll become your way will be in PMBOK, and then everyone will do it, and then the next great idea will take 10 years to get implemented, or 15 years to get implemented.
So why do you think that is? I share the same opinion, and I've got my own point of view. But why do you think that things just take forever?
In that space, because that's like the engineering world, and most of these problems are foundationally engineering problems, right? Like to build something big that extracts the volumes and separates the things. Like we are dealing with an engineering space. A lot of it is, the whole mindset is based on, is it repeatable? Like this is how we did it. It worked. Let's do it again. Right. Like, and so, despite the claim of innovation of various companies, I mean, a lot of the technology, like a lot of the means and methods that we use to separate chemicals from the ground or generate electricity were either like invented 100 years ago or 200 years ago and been slowly but surely, improved upon. But I mean, when was machine welding really put into place? You know what I mean? Like, so AI, I don't know. I don't have a totally good answer to this. It's more an observation than a root cause analysis of it, I guess. I wish I knew, but there's just like this like lugging. So with AI, I think AI can transform the world we live in from a productivity perspective. I think I think anyone with a white collar has is at risk of being seriously having their role seriously diminished by AI. The productivity is the productivity enhancement, I think, is incredible. But of course, anything in this world, when it comes down to it, is about creating something and doing something in the world, and it's for people with people. So it'll always come back to people. Um, so all that was to say, in trends in risk management, I think there's a trend of trends in risk management and risk forecasting, which is a little bit of what I was getting at before, was like if you have a million billion resources, you just go count and pull it all together and know everything. And back to your COVID conversation, the whole idea of risk management and risk forecasting is to make the unknowable or the unforeseen somewhat quantified, managed, create a protection as a competitive advantage. One thing I started to see was too much proceduralization around it and too much granularity. It doesn't. I don't think it works. I don't think it created a lot of value, and it becomes burdensome because of communication. Because of communication with regulators, with the government, with stakeholders. Um, so, what does all that mean? Hey, I'm a landowner. How are you managing the risk of this pipeline exploding in my backyard? How do I know that you have it covered? And so you can go create all these spreadsheets and all these models, and you can do all this stuff. Does it mean anything if the people on the ground aren't doing what your model says they're going to do? Does it mean anything? And statistically, if it's 99% safe, there's always 1% where this event can occur. So you see what I'm saying? I guess what I'm trying to get at is I think there's a drive to making it too granular, too known in an attempt to communicate out. And I think that belies the truth of the space, which is it's unknown. We don't know what's going to happen all the time.
You're a risk professional. How does the risk profession translate to your personal life?
My son can say the word probability and knows what it means. And he just turned 6. I guess the big thing is, do you have kids?
I do. I have 2 kids under 4 years old.
So, you know about risk.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I don't have a model.
Yeah. It's funny because I guess some people have joked with me that they're like, "Oh, you're a risk professional. You must don't do anything fun." But I loved mountain biking as a kid. I love snowboarding and downhill skiing, and I like double black runs, and you know what I mean. I like taking risks. Actually, this is because my son and I were at a high ropes course here in Montreal, down by the old port, where we were up 2 stories in the air and walking across a little rope and holding onto ropes. We're roped in and everything. But I think what it taught me about tolerance and acceptance, and what can be known, what cannot be, what risks are worth taking, I guess. That's how I guess that's the biggest one, is what risks are worth taking. Not everything can be known. And then actually the value of taking risks. I know, especially men in their 40s need a little bit of adrenaline to keep weight off, so what are you doing in your exercise that gives you a little risk? I know there's a great big, I asked about kids because I've got 2 young kids, and there's a whole movement of risky play to let children play in a way that they take risks, because they learn faster. They also, get that little dose of adrenaline, but there's cognitive impacts to it.
What's your position? So I learned about this a couple weeks ago when my wife's cousin was over, and one of the kids was standing up on the kitchen table, walking along the edge of it, and she's like, "The kid will learn." I'm like, "Oh my gosh!"
I always joke, gravity is the best teacher. I probably I'm a little too laissez-faire. I gives the strong suggestion, hey, that's probably not a great idea. Hey, that bridge that you built isn't really a bridge; it's really a death trap. Oh, you're going to step on it anyway? I told you to fix it. Oh, you're not going to do it? Okay, well, see what happens. In the safety world, there's a lot of talk of human performance factors. So the one thing I really, really like about it is, how can you fail safely? Knowing, and fail is such a strong word, but knowing that not everything goes perfectly, not everything, how can you take risks without it costing a leg or a tooth or an eye, so that's my vision of it, where it's well, yeah, you're going to get hurt. My daughter the other day split her chin open at the playground, and I super glued it shut because I didn't want to go to the hospital. Even that was a risk. It was a calculated risk, is like, yeah, she probably could have used 2 stitches, probably just 2. But I did my research and I talked to a couple friends who are nurses, and I made it work. With especially with the kids, I love it. I think it's great because, okay, you're not going to listen to me. You're not going to listen to me all the time. How can I make it safe for you to learn this lesson without it costing you something permanent? I love it. I think it's great.
Inevitably, there's going to be people considering a career in risk, industrial construction. And as they're considering this as their career, what guidance would you be able to share with them that would help them opt in, opt out?
I would say this is for anyone. I was blessed with the reality of having to string tubs on small inch pipeline and be a welder's helper. And, I was a cost clerk for a winter in a pipeline project outside of Grand Cache. And I know what a D9 looks like. And I've driven a Hitachi excavator up and down off of the back of a truck. And I'm not saying I know anything like but what I do know, I know because I saw it, because I touched it. We do have this in I say this we in our industry, we do sort of have this, oh, well, if you haven't been in the field, you don't know anything. That's not true either. And there's a value in making contact with what you're talking about at that atomic level of, if you work for a pipeline company, you move gas from A to B. Maybe you should go out and see how we do that. You work for, it's sort of like a know your client, an extreme form of know your client, but it's sort of more like know yourself, know what game you're playing, know what you're doing, make contact with the thing you're trying to understand. And because you can't know the gray zones if you don't know the black and the white. Right? Like you can't really do it. So, especially from the risk space, a conclusion of this concept is you're in a risk session and someone goes, oh yeah, this is mitigated. No, it's not. No, it's not, because I know what a mitigation looks like and you are nowhere close to having it priced in. Right? Like it comes like that. Like you become an instant filter, for lack of a better word, of bullshit, but more like delusion or hope, wishful thinking, because and then someone goes, oh no, that really is the mitigation. And look, it's a new technology and it works way better than that, and it's an eighth the price. Oh, okay, well, now I've made contact with something new. I've learned something new. I've seen something new. Gosh, I would love to get on a plane or get in a truck and drive out and see that. And I was blessed with that. I had the ability to not just start my career out there understanding what safety risk looks like from a safety perspective, but also being able to go to different sites, construction sites, and see the work being done, not just sit in a ivory tower.
I love that. Couldn't agree more. It's a privilege to do that, right?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah. In anything, right?
For sure.
In anything.